Hi, I'm Cameron Lavelle at yourparenthelp.com, and today, just to kind of continue laying the foundation, I wanted to talk about the 5 areas of reading. Very first one is phonological awareness or phonemic awareness. They're similar, there's a slight difference. The biggest thing you need to be focused on with phonological awareness or phonemic awareness is knowing that it's mostly about the sounds within words and how they are manipulated. So phonological awareness would include rhyming, and that's like a really big foundational one, so especially if you have really little ones, do your rhyming, play with rhyming. If you have an older child who's struggling, where it's you're noticing some struggles, you definitely want to notice, are they able to rhyme or not, because that can be a foundational skill. A child can learn to read without rhyming, but it is a foundational skill, and we'll kind of talk about that. The other ones that are really big that are phonemic awareness are blending and segmenting. And they would also be under the umbrella of phonological awareness. And again, it's about the sounds in words. So blending is taking the individual sounds, like k, at, and blending that together to say cat. Segmenting is doing the opposite, going from cat and then hearing the individual sounds, k, at. For some of us, this was really easy for us when we were kids. We don't remember learning it even. It was like, that's no big deal. Obviously, those sounds, take them, break them apart, it's easy. Other kids have a really hard time recognizing that there's individual sounds in a word and figuring out that these individual sounds get blended together to make this word. And then the rhyming is playing with those same kind of ideas of sounds, where you've got an initial sound and then the rest of the word, and you're going back to, you're taking off that initial sound and putting in a new sound, so that they have to be able to manipulate the sounds in the words. And it becomes very helpful when they're reading that then they can read cat, bat, sat, because they start to see this AT always says at. So I just changed the first sound, k, at, s, at, yeah, cat, fat, sat. So, and it keeps going up. An advanced phonological awareness game that you can play, that I do like to do with kids when we get to that point, is Pig Latin. Because if you remember Pig Latin, you take off the initial consonant sound, put it at the end of the word, and add a. So, like the word fan would be anfe, cat would be atk. So if kids can figure out how to take this sound and move it here and then add an ending, that's a lot of phonological awareness that they're having to do in their head. Even written out can be really confusing for kids. But it's a fun game to play, because if they can do that, then they have really good phonological awareness. So that's a good one to play. That was the first area of reading, phonological awareness. Phonemic awareness sometimes gets stated instead, but it's a little more narrow in definition. The next one is phonics. So now we've talked about using sounds within words. The next level would be phonics, which is knowing the relationship between sounds and letters. You know, that's where you're learning A says ah, B says b, not b, but b. C says k or s. So the basic letter sounds. And actually I shouldn't have said A says a. A says a or a. And then it gets into the digraphs and blends, and knowing that ing says ing, and sh says sh, and tion says shun. So it gets into more complex stuff in later years. It's not just the very basics of what you typically learn in kindergarten, and even first grade. We keep learning phonics, and it does keep getting more advanced. We get into all those suffixes and prefixes in some of the later grades. And phonics actually becomes very relevant in those later grades because you start looking at really big words like colonialization, and you're like, it's such a big word. But if the child knows how to break the word apart into chunks, then they can read that word. Whereas if they haven't learned those basic phonics skills, then it becomes much more difficult for them because some kids don't learn phonics. Either because they weren't taught it or because they have a true dyslexia and it's extremely difficult for them, and people have tried to teach it to them, but they don't understand it still, that it isn't how they read, and they can be very successful readers that are more sight readers. They've heard that this is what this word looks like, they know that this is what this word says, and they just read a whole word as a whole word. They don't break it apart or any of that. So the very severe children with dyslexia tend to kind of have that profile of they just don't use any or very little phonics, and they can be taught it, and there are strategies, but it does require a lot more intensive help in really feeling the sounds in your mouth, hearing those and seeing those sounds. Like, you really have to play with sounds a lot for those kids. But they can be successful readers without that. It just tends to require them to have heard a word to be able to read that word. So if they see colonialization and they've never read it, they've never heard it, then they might say capitalization because that's a word they've heard and it looks kind of similar. And it doesn't make any sense in their sentence and they don't know why, and they just move on. Or maybe they don't move on, maybe they look it up and then they know what it means, but unless they click on something that reads it to them, they don't know how to say it. They aren't able to recognize those pieces and put them together. But some kids are very good sight readers. That's just how they read. They do well with it. They can accommodate it by using, some resources like Google. Like, you can type in a word and it'll read it to you if you want. So some kids, that's a better use of their time. Other kids, they benefit from having learned those phonics. Kind of got off on a tangent there, but it's a relevant tangent because of that very prevalent learning disability. So, phonological/phonemic awareness, phonics. Then the next one is vocabulary. Now, vocabulary is interesting because it's what words mean. And it's hard to teach that more than just using the words. Having somebody look something up in a dictionary and write down the definition doesn't teach them what the word means. They still have no idea. Or they can recite it back to you, but they don't really know what it means. Kids learn what a word means by using it, by hearing it used, and by using it. So if you're reading with your child and they come to a word and they're like, what does that mean? And then you explain it. The thing you want to then do is remind them of that word. Try to find reasons to use that word in the next 24 hours, 48 hours. Try to use it as much as you can so that then they keep hearing it. Maybe you show it to them again in another way. Maybe you write something down that you're using and they can see it that way. But you want to expose them to that word again and again and again in a variety of ways. Not just the same one sentence that you were practicing or that you gave as an example the first time. We'll stick with colonialization as an example. If they're reading a text and says colonialization, then find ways to talk about that. And it might seem very obscure, but you can talk about, the colonialization of Australia versus the colonialization of America, and explain those differences. And, you can get into some of that and really explain it to them until they really understand it. And then you can ask them, like, well, can you think of any other examples of colonialization? And then they can talk about that. Another strategy with something like colonialization is you can use prefixes and suffixes and teach that, and those meanings, because that's a huge part of vocabulary and vocabulary development, that if a child sees that word for the first time and they recognize, oh, but I know the word colony, and I know what shun I have a feeling of what that means. Maybe they don't know the exact, definition, but I kind of know what it means. So they can play with that and they can see it and they can kind of have a general idea at least of what it means. So teaching those prefixes and suffixes can really help with vocabulary development in the older kids a little bit. So we've talked about phonological / phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and these aren't necessarily in a specific order, but kind of generally talked about. So fluency is how fluently you read, and it usually gets measured in how fast you read. I don't love that, but I definitely don't completely disagree with it either. It's all about how well you're able to read as if you're speaking. So you read a text and you read it as if you're saying that to someone that's kind of conversational, and so that you understand it. Because if you read, the cat jumped over the, or even worse, the cat, so that becomes very challenging for a child to have any idea what they're reading. It doesn't make sense to them because they aren't hearing it the way that they would hear it in conversation. So for kids like that, you really need them to be going back. If they are reading the cat, then the cat, they need to go back to the cat. So let me give that example again. They're reading. They go the cat, the cat, jumped. The cat jumped. And then continue. So as they're going back, they're reinforcing it, they're getting more fluent, it's beginning to make more sense to them. Now, after they've read the whole page or the whole paragraph or whatever makes sense for their age of development, have them read it again. And again. And again. You want them reading it until they're basically just they've memorized it, but it sounds fluent. You want them to get expressive, you want them to have good intonation, you want them to pause at periods and commas, you want them to read it the way that it was written and made to be read. So the more you model that in read alouds to your child, which I don't think you ever need to stop, I don't care how old your child is, model it in read alouds and also model or ask them to do it in their reading. Kind of have that expectation and make it fun. You know, they can play with it, they can get dramatic, they can dress up while they're reading something, but we do want them being fluent, being excited about their reading. So phonological awareness, phonemic awareness were number one. Phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and then the really big one, the reason that we read, is for comprehension. We read to get something out of reading. We read to understand what we're reading. So reading comprehension tends to be sort of seen as like the overarching thing, that it's the reason we're reading, and if you are struggling with any of those other ones, you might not be able to comprehend. So comprehension I always think about in kind of two different ways. If a student is struggling with comprehension, I want to know, how is their phonological awareness, phonemics, vocabulary, fluency, how do those look? Are one of those impacting their ability to comprehend what they're reading? Or are they stellar at all of that and they still don't know what they're reading? Because those are two very separate problems. And when I'm measuring a student's reading ability, I'm usually also measuring their listening comprehension. So if I take all the reading components out of it and they're just listening to a story, how well do they understand that? How well are they able to recall just straight facts? How well are they able to analyze it and explain things and take it further and make predictions? So when I'm looking at those two pieces, if they have great listening comprehension and they have good vocabulary, but their phonics and their fluency are poor, okay, I know what to do with that. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time working on comprehension, because the reason they're not comprehending is most likely because they can't read it. You can't comprehend what you can't read. So I'll work with them on that. But there are students who phonological awareness is great, phonics are great, vocabulary is great, fluency is great. They sound beautiful when they read, and then you ask them questions or ask them to retell, you ask them to analyze, and some portion or all of them, they have no idea. I don't know. Or they come up with something, you're like, where did you get that? That doesn't make any sense. and that's when we really need to focus on the comprehension piece. With that, I do have a free giveaway if you haven't gotten it yet at yourparenthelp.com/reading comprehension. And there's, it's called the Octopus's Guide to Reading Comprehension, and it gives you 8 strategies to work on reading comprehension specifically. And within that, I kind of pair it with listening comprehension because they're so related. Most students who struggle with reading comprehension are struggling with listening comprehension as well. Not 100%, but there's a strong correlation there. So sometimes it's more about take off the reading elements, because if they're also struggling, there are students who struggle with phonics, fluency, and comprehension, then you need to work on both. You need to work on all of that. But when you're working on comprehension, you don't want them to also be struggling with the phonics and the fluency. You want to try to take that piece out for right now. You're reading it aloud to them, they're working on that comprehension piece. If you were trying to get them to work on everything at once, it becomes way too big, way too overwhelming. So again, yourparenthelp.com/reading comprehension will get you a free download that goes over some reading strategies, and you can sign up for my email list and get notified of when I do these videos and get a lot of reading, writing, math support for you educating your child. Have a fabulous day, and I'll see you next week.